Hi and welcome to this video about learning theory. Today we are going to take a closer look at behaviorism. So let's start off with a general overview of what we will talk about in this video. Then you can go back to this later and get a quick reminder when needed. Behaviorism started out in the early 1900s and was very dominant for many years. It sees learning as a change in behavior through external events, stimuli response. It sees knowledge as something that happens passively, and it studies the observable learning outcomes. It is known for doing a lot of experiments with animals. You might have heard about Pavlov's dogs, for example. It also talks about connecting an automated response to a new stimulus. That's called classical conditioning. And most animal training, like teaching a dog how to sit, is behaviorism, but then it's operant conditioning. It's sometimes actually talked about as the carrot and the stick, which is extremely simplified and also not really correct. The key figures here are Pavlov, Watson, Thorndike, and Skinner. Good to know here is that this video will contain a lot of concepts. You are not expected to know them by heart, but it's important to have heard them and understand the basic principles. And then you can recognize them when you run into them and know what it is about. Behaviorism have two main parts, classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And if you haven't already, before moving on, pause this video and watch these other videos explaining these concepts. So first watch the classical conditioning video for 2 minutes and 43 seconds and then the operant conditioning video for 2 minutes and 55 seconds. Okay, here is a slide with a lot of text. This is a glossary for the things talked about in the videos you just watched. So I won't go through them again, but they are here, so you can pause or come back to it later if you want to. Instead, I will do a quick summarize of the videos we watch and go slightly deeper into some of the things they touched upon. So let's start with classical conditioning. Key figures here are Ivan Pavlov and John Brodius Watson. Classical conditioning is when you take a strong biological stimulus and pair it with a neutral stimulus. The response from the strong stimulus is then transferred also to the neutral stimulus, where it creates a similar response. So it's about creating an automated response to a new stimulus. The classic example here is Pavlov's work with dogs and a bell. Pavlov was also the first that studied this in detail, and classical conditioning is sometimes also called Pavlovian conditioning. This is not as relevant specifically for role-playing games, but it is the foundation for behaviorism. Operant conditioning. Here we have Edward Thorndike and Boris Frederick Skinner. And operant conditioning is a learning process where a behavior is strengthened or weakened through consequences and antecedents. So here comes the ABC, the antecedent, the behavior, the consequence. You have starting conditions, then you have the behavior response to these conditions, and then what happens as an effect of the behavior. I want to spend a little more time going through positive and negative reinforcement, since it's often misunderstood and used wrong. So I have made a table that I will walk you through. First thing I want to highlight, positive here means adding something. And negative means taking something away. It doesn't say anything about if it's good or bad. The second thing I want to highlight is that reinforcement will strengthen a behavior while punishment will weaken a behavior. So let's go through them together. First, we have positive reinforcement. So here we are strengthening a behavior. This is when something that is perceived as good is added. So for example, you get extra experience points for helping out prepping for the game. And this leads to feelings of happiness. Then we have negative reinforcement. This is also by strengthening behavior. So something that is perceived as bad is taken away. For example, you helped out a new player, so the GM now says you don't have to clean. And this leads to a feeling of relief. And I need to already be in a negative space for this to work. By being in a bad situation, you can then take something away to make it better. When it's used on yourself, this can often lead to avoidance, like when you have to do something hard and are stressed and you just skip out to not have to deal. And then you feel relieved because you didn't have to do the hard thing. And this can lead to reinforcing skipping out. Then we have positive punishment. So this is about weakening behavior. So something that is perceived as bad is added. So for example, getting yelled at for killing off another player's character, and it leads to fear and shame. And this is very often used wrong. For example, my mom told me about how whenever they had a test in her school, one person in the class that did the best got a big pen to have at the desk, while the one who did the worst got a cleaning brush made out of a bundle of twigs to have at the desk. But since giving them that brush is a positive punishment, it can only weaken behavior, not strengthen it. And here you probably want to motivate the students to study more so that then you are actually working against what you want to achieve. And then we have negative punishment. This is about weakening behavior again. So something that is perceived as good is taken away. So for example, you show up drunk to a game and you get banned, both from this one and from the next game. I hope this helps you to understand the difference a little bit more, because it can be tricky. And since we are talking about punishment, there are a number of things that are problematic when it comes to using punishment. Using punishment for modifying human behavior is today seen as questionable also within behaviorism. So you have the pure ethical reason why it's problematic, but it also doesn't show you what is right. It only shows you what you shouldn't do, not what you should do instead. And if it's not strong enough, or if it's used too often, it can lead to escalation. You can also end up in the situation with surveillance, where the person only does the right behavior when the person enforcing the punishment is there. It's also very hard to use in a correct and effective way. Positive punishment needs to be really strong and happen directly in relation to the behavior to have an effect. If it's just playfully saying, no, don't do that, no, it can become a fun game, and then it's positive reinforcement instead. And if it's used too strongly, it can potentially lead to trauma. And even when it's used at once and at a good level, the effect usually is short-term. So what would this mean for the example we had for negative punishment, being banned after showing up drunk to a game? It probably won't change the behavior of the individual, but it might be a good choice to make anyway to protect the rest of the group. Is it ever okay to use punishment? Maybe if someone is hurting themselves or others? I don't know. What do you think? Okay, more words. Extinction. Undoing the conditioning through presenting the conditioned stimulus in absence of the unconditioned stimulus. So for example, hearing a bell while not getting food after the conditioning, or ignoring a behavior to make it go away. So another character is taunting your character by running around them, honking a horn, and your character wants this to stop. You can then either use positive punishment by in-game screaming at them to shut up, or negative punishment by taking the horn away from them. Or you can use extinction by just ignoring them so they don't think it's fun anymore and stops. But in role-playing games, we have the situation where our character wants the behavior to stop, but not us as players. So if we are using punishment, then we want to use punishment so we punish the other character and not the other player. And if we use extinction, we also need to be clear if it's the character or the player we want to stop. And this is why we need to think about and communicate about our interactions. Intermittent reinforcement. This is a conditioning schedule in which a reward or a punishment, reinforcement, is not administered every time the desired response is performed. It's often randomized. So for example, you keep rolling the dice in a fight instead of fleeing because you might be able to make it. And there is an increased likelihood that the desired behavior will continue with intermittent reinforcement, and the behavior actually lasts longer than when using continuous reinforcement. And that is what is used for gambling. For example, in a vending machine, you put stuff in, get something out every time. In a slot machine, you put something in, you only get something out sometimes. Classical conditioning is about associating an involuntary response, like a reflex, with a stimulus, while operant conditioning is about associating a voluntary behavior and a consequence, and that's the difference between them. So, how does behaviorism relate to games and transformative play? Here are some examples. I won't go deep into them, and if there's anything you don't understand or want to know about, some will be touched upon later in our course, and some you can find by searching online. But generally, intermittent reinforcement and operant conditioning are very much used today in relations to games and play. For example, in gambling, as mentioned with intermittent reinforcement with the slot machines. In digital games with level systems and login bonuses and loot boxes. Gamification, if you have heard of that, with nudging and badges and point systems. And designing LARPs and tabletop is about trying to control player behaviors for a certain experience. We also use role-playing games to rehearse behaviors. Group culture goes into here. What types of behaviors are we reinforcing, and what do we want to reinforce? For motivation, this is relevant. It's also used in therapy, but then as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. So for CBT, only parts are used and in combination with cognitivism. And cognitivism is actually the topic for the next video. So, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video about cognitivism.